Thank you, and hello everyone. I think Vedanta Bibula Sahib and Danish Iqbal Sahib have almost set the agenda as it were. I think there is a long history of what we are talking, and this history does not necessarily start with the emergence of the Delhi Sultanate, the coming of Islam in proper Hindustan. There is a longer history, but certainly the Delhi Sultanate and the rule of the Mughals created that context in which Sufism would be flourishing with all its ethical precepts and mystical dimensions, of which Qawwali is a major component. Devotional songs, musical practices are part of almost all forms of devotional, mystical traditions universally. And if we look at historical literature, say from the 11th century, roughly from the time when Sufi literature would be emerging, this is also very interesting that the earliest Sufi texts in Persian were written in Lahore in the 11th century. Data Ganj Baksh, Sheikh Ali Hujwari's authoritative compositions called Kashful Majoob, the revelations of the hidden ones, Makhfi from Majoob. And this text straight away talks about how of many adabs, many rules and regulations, norms of proper conduct in Sufism included a chapter on adab sama, norms of comportment with regard to proper conduct in Sufi Sama, Mahfil Sama or Majlis Sama, of which Qawwali is a part. And because some elements, someone was referring to Orthodox Islam, some custodians of traditional Islam, juridical Islam, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali might be issuing fatwa against the Qawwalis, but there was nothing un-Islamic in Qawwali performances. And therefore there was a continuous need also at the same time to talk about what exactly is happening in the Mahfil Sama and the Qawwali performances. It is about love and devotion for God, it is devotion for the Prophet, it is with reference to very fine poetry that is composed, beginning with Arabic compositions, Quranic recitations, to begin with Fatiha, and also eventually in Eastern Islamic world, Persian poetry. But when we come to Hindustan, Persian poetry is not our language. Already in the 13th, 14th century, people are speaking the way we are speaking here in our modern times, language keeping changing. And therefore, Hindi, and the Qawwali in Hindi. If the Sufis and Qawwal go to Deccan, they switch over to Dakhini, which eventually becomes Urdu. When they go to Bengal, it becomes Bengali. When they are in Punjab, it is Punjabi. So it becomes very, very part of vernacular devotional poetry. And the political context is certainly important. If Delhi Sultanate had not happened, Sufis of the kind that we know of, the Chishtis, would not have happened. Would not have happened in 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century Rajputana. It happened in the 13th, 14th century context. So much as there was tension between the political domain and the spiritual domain, as Alauddin Khalji threatening to meet Nizamuddin Aulia and Nizamuddin Aulia refusing to do so. You mentioned about Aurangzeb and Darashuko contradictions, but we know that there was element of mysticism there also. Aurangzeb was being very, very strongly backed by the Naqshbandi Sufis, and they were Sufis in their own right. Not like the ones we would like, Chishti or Qadri kinds, but Sufis nonetheless. And of course, this distinction was being continuously made with regard to the presence of women. Much as presence of musical instruments was not liked in the Sufi tradition for a very, very long time. All the musical instruments which are supposed to be khayal, santarana, rag, etc., which are supposed to have been invented, improvised upon by Amir Khusro, and Amir Khusro was the closest disciple of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, and Nizamuddin Aulia was very, very clear that mazamir, instruments are not required. Apparently, Sufi tradition very, very strongly believes, and I have a book here, on महफिल समा के आदाब व अहकामात by Qadri Fida Muhammad Naqibi of Lahore, which very clearly mentions with reference to Data Ganj Bakhsh 11th century Kashf al-Majoob that all the instruments that we know of, tabla, guitar, dolak, etc., are the inventions of Shaitan, Shaitan ka baap, Iblis. So that, and there was a competition between the performance of musical instruments on the one hand and those who were with a fine voice reciting poetry. And it was clear that eventually fine voice, fine poetry, some poetry of love, that could be Premakyan, that could be a ghazal in Persian, that could be some Arabic formula expressing love for the divine, that people will stop and listen to that. Even donkeys will stop and listen to music. Birds will, camels is mentioned. So there was this argument, very aggressive argument, that only donkeys have no sense of music, in contrast to the ulama, maintaining that position like a stone which is not moved. And Data Ganj Bakhsh said, no, even a donkey has a sense of music, because the bell hanging with the neck will that make the creature, engrossed in thought so much that you can continue to abuse the donkey with the hard work that was. So there were restrictions with regard to instruments or not, and instruments become very important part of Qawwali performance. We know within the Qawwali tradition also, gharanas, families, groups, there is a tension between whether the instrumentalist will be privileged or whether the vocalist, and it has to be vocalist with the fine composition of poetry and the presence of women. Now, the society that we are talking about historically down to the present is very patriarchal. It accepts the presence of women around us, but it does not always like the major presence, there. And therefore, there is a long discussion with regard to just like instruments are not required and yet part of Qawwali, performances, women cannot be debarred either. So, Mahfil Sama practices, performances have to be conducted in a milieu where, people of the same zawq, and a zawq would be a part of it, and there could be some circle in which women can also be included. And increasingly we know that women are sought to be excluded. In Nizamuddin Aulia's time, women were not prevented from meeting him in person whenever they wanted to. But now, in our 21st century, we know the enclosure of the dargah as a sign written clearly in Hindi, महिलाओं का अंदर जाना मना है. They are not being allowed. As in Haji Ali dargah in Mumbai, suddenly overnight they decided women will not be allowed to enter inside. So women challenged that, lost the case in Mumbai High Court, but Bombay High Court, then they came to Supreme Court. Supreme Court gave the judgment in favor of women, but overnight they created an iron enclosure around the grave and locked it, saying we are preventing everyone from entering the mazar area because it is shirk. It is polytheism. But all the mafia dons, politicians, ministers, etc., who have access to the dargah people, their trustees, etc., they can open the lock and for men to go and prostrate there, and women are being prevented. In Nizamuddin Aulia's time, there was discussion that how such and such women are allowed to have access to you, whereas we know that women have some limitations, etc. People would be speaking suggestively with regard to their purity, which is often was the case in the Mumbai case, as in Shalimala. So Nizamuddin's suggestion was very instructive. I can speak for 2 minutes. It was very instructive and that was with reference to Bibi Masam, who is buried here, on the Lodi Road, itself a contemporary to both Baba Farid and Nizamuddin Aulia. That this is a person, a woman who is a Sufi. She had gone for Hajj in 13th century, came back, and would be composing fine devotional poetry, would organize Mahfil Sama, would also spend a lot of money in charity, especially running langars, feeding people, which is very important. And then people will say that, but she is a woman. So how could it be that she is being given so much respect as something like a Sufi-like figure, and yet she was a woman? So the statement that Baba Farid and Nizamuddin Aulia made, Nizamuddin Aulia quoted Baba Farid as saying that this is a woman who is who is a Sufi figure, and she is a Mardana in the garb of a woman, and she is practicing Sufism because Sufism is an act of Mardanagi. This is Nizamuddin Aulia's verse in Fawaid al-Fuad. Sufism is an act of Mardanagi, which can be practiced even by a woman. And therefore, very, very aggressive statement that when a lion comes out of the jungle, no one asks whether this lion is he or she, male or female. This is with reference to Bibi Fatma's song. And with regard to purity, with which I will stop, which is often a concern, very, very ludicrous, with regard to menstruation and the notion of impurity attached to it. Nizamuddin Aulia narrated a hadith of the Prophet to the effect that a woman came to meet Prophet Muhammad and told him that she is bleeding all the time and it's not stopping, and therefore she is not in a position to pray, because during that period perhaps there is an exemption that maybe because you are bleeding so much that you cannot perform wuzu and go for namaz, or your janamaz gets soiled. So Prophet Muhammad, and this should be known to people. We know that we are sensitive here, but the public does not know. Prophet Muhammad told her that as and when you want to perform namaz, like 5 times a day, you perform your wuzu and perform your prayers, even if the janamaz is soiled, or blood is stained, etc. It does not matter. Now, this kind of sophistication in terms of and sensitivity that is part of the Sufi tradition, ethically and thinking in terms of larger, more sensitive manner with regard to whether we are dealing with men and women and transgenders or whether animals, is often lacking in our society, which is different from what we have in our Sufi tradition, and which is very much emphasized vocally all the time by Qawwals in a very, very exuberant language. Nizamuddin Aulia said, Qawwals are singing songs heralding the arrival of the Prophet and his message all the time, and therefore this is entirely Islamic. There is nothing un-Islamic about Qawwali the way it is practiced. It can also be sung in pub, and I don't think there is any stigma can be attached to it. If people go into pub and drinking and want to listen to some very fine numbers, Qawwali numbers, whether Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan or Abida Parveen or whoever, that is a sign of the relevance and significance and importance of poetry of love in our lives. Only people who do not have heart will not be able to appreciate music and Qawwali the way it is practiced for centuries now. And not only 13th century or 14th century, Baba Farid or Qutbuddin Bakhtiar Kaki here, but a longer history goes back to Khorasan and to Iran, to Arabia.